The corn crib came up out of the earth like a drowned man's surfacing, its timbers black with a century of rot, its ridgepole crowned in the pale wildflowers that grow where nothing else will. And Delphine Roach stood over the hole her hogs had made, with her hands hanging useless at her sides. Below her, 41 hogs went on rooting through the collapsed floor of a structure no living soul in Coldwater County remembered building, their snouts turning up things that caught the light. And the whole town, had they been there to see it, would have said she had finally cracked, the way they had promised each other she would. But there was no one there to see it. There never had been. That was the whole trouble, and it was also, though she did not yet understand it, the whole salvation. 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1889, Delphine Roach had $85 folded into the toe of a stocking, and no living relative closer than a second cousin in Memphis who had made it plain she was not welcome. She was 26 years old, widowed at 24, when the mule kicked her husband, and the fever finished what the kick began, and she had learned in the 2 years since that a woman alone in that country was a thing the country did not know what to do with. It could not marry her off, for she would not have it. It could not send her home, for she had no home to be sent to. So it did the next thing, which was to sell her what nobody else would buy. There was a parcel out past the Little Tallahatchie, 85 acres of bottomland, that a man named Fenwick had let go to Johnson Grass, so complete and so vicious that 3 families in a row had broken themselves trying to farm it. Johnson Grass, if you have never fought it, is not a weed so much as a war. It sends its roots down deep as a well and out sideways under the whole field, and you may plow it and burn it and curse it, and it will laugh at you from below the ground and come up thicker the next spring. The county wanted the land off its books. They offered it to Delphine at $1 an acre, and old Harlan Pettibone, who kept the ledger, said it to her face with a smile that was mostly pity, that she'd have done better to burn the $85 for the heat. She bought it. She counted the $85 out onto Pettibone's desk in coin and small bills, and the men loitering by the stove watched her do it the way you'd watch a child walk out onto thin ice, half hoping, in the meanness that lives in idle men, to see it break. 85 acres for $85, and it left her exactly nothing but a wagon, a sway-backed mare named Junie, and a debt of $40 at Absalom Cruz's Mercantile that she had promised to clear by autumn. That was the arithmetic of it, and she did the arithmetic that first night in the ruin of the Fenwick cabin, with the wind coming through the chinking, and the arithmetic said she was ruined already. 85 acres she could not plant. A grass she could not kill. A store debt she could not pay. She sat with a stub of pencil and a torn envelope, and she wrote the numbers down and looked at them a long while. Then she did a thing that would have surprised the men at the stove, who had already decided how her story ended. She did not weep. She turned the envelope over and began, on the clean side, to think. What she thought about was the grass. Everybody in the county hated the Johnson grass the way you hate a thing that has beaten you, and hating it, they had stopped looking at it. But Delphine had grown up poor, on a hardscrabble farm in the hills, the kind of poor where you learn to look at everything twice because you cannot afford to waste even the things other people throw away. And she looked at that grass now, not as an enemy, but as a fact. It grew. Lord, how it grew! It grew where corn would not, and cotton would not, and a man's hopes would not. It grew tall and thick, and it grew fast, and it grew, she noticed, all summer long, when everything else in that heat lay down and quit. And a thing that grows, she thought, is a thing that is turning sun and rain and dirt into more of itself. The only question that had ever mattered on any farm anywhere, was whether you could find a mouth that would eat what the land was willing to grow. Cattle would founder on Johnson grass. It could turn poison in a drought and kill a cow standing. But there was one mouth in all the world that would eat nearly anything green or rotten or run to ruin. One animal built, low and stubborn and greedy enough to turn a curse into meat. She sat in the cold cabin and she thought about hogs. The next morning she rode Junie into town, and she spent 4 of the dollars she did not, strictly speaking, have, on 2 bred sows and a boar, from a man named Odell Turnage, who was glad enough to be rid of stock he'd been half-starving through a lean spring. Turnage was a decent man, one of the few, and he threw in a sack of shelled corn for nothing, and told her, not unkindly, that he'd never known hogs to fatten on Johnson grass alone, and she oughtn't count on it. Delphine thanked him and did not argue. She had already learned that arguing with a verdict only fixes it harder in the mind of the one who made it. She loaded the hogs into the wagon and drove them out to the ruined bottom, and she turned them loose into the sea of green, and she watched. That was her gift if she had one, and it was the only one. The town had never thought to laugh at because they had never noticed she had it. She watched. She saw the sows plunge into the grass, and she saw them do the thing that changed everything, the thing Turnage had never seen, because he'd never had the desperation to turn hogs into a field of it and simply wait. The hogs did not eat the blades. The hogs went down after the roots. Johnson grass keeps its life in its roots, those thick white rhizomes that run under the ground like a nest of pale snakes. And they are sweet, sweeter than the top of the plant, full of the sugar the plant lays up to survive the winter. And a hog is a plow with an appetite. The sows drove their snouts into that black bottomland soil that 3 families had cursed and quit, and they rooted, turning it, tearing the white roots up by the yard, and crunching them down, and behind them they left the earth broken open and dark, and Delphine saw kneeling in it that first week with the dirt to her wrists. Richer than any soil she had ever touched, the hogs were killing the grass, not by the acre and not in a day, but killing it all the same, eating the very thing that made it immortal, and fattening while they did it. She stood up out of the mud, with her hands black to the elbow, and she felt something she had not felt since before the mule and the fever, and it frightened her a little. How much it felt like hope, she told no one. This was the coal she banked low under the ash, all through that first year, and it took a discipline in her that the loud men of the town could never have managed. When Absalom Crew's boy came out to remind her, in his father's words, that the $40 was due at harvest, she said she was aware of it and offered him nothing else. When women in town asked her, in the sugared way that hides a knife, how she was managing all alone out on the Fenwick place, she said she was managing, which was true, and let them make of it whatever pleased them. What pleased them was to make of it a sad story, a foolish woman, and her hogs and her weeds, and they told that story to each other with relish, because it made their own hard lives feel wiser by comparison. It is easier to believe a thing is doomed than to admit you were a fool to mock it. So Delphine let them keep their story, and she kept her hogs. And the 2 bred sows farrowed in the late summer, and she had, by first frost, 17 head where she had started with 3, and a field where the grass grew visibly thinner along the tracks the pigs had cleared. There was one man in the county who did not laugh, and it was to him she finally went. His name was Tobiah Wise, an old German who had come over the water 40 years before and kept a little farm on the high ground above the river, a neat, poor, immaculate place where everything was mended twice and thrown away never. He was near 70, and his back had gone to a question mark, and his English still carried the old country in it like a stone carries the shape of the water that shaped it. Delphine had done him a kindness once, sat up 2 nights with him when he had the pleurisy, and no one else would come, and old Wise was a man who did not forget a kindness any more than he forgot a debt. She went to him in the autumn of that first year, and she told him, because she had to tell someone, or burst, what the hogs were doing to the grass. And Tobiah Wise listened to the whole of it, and then he was quiet a long time, and then he said the thing she would carry the rest of her life. He said, in that country, the poor do not own the good land, and so the poor must learn to see the good in the land that is left to them. For the earth is honest, and it will pay any debt if you only find the coin it keeps its riches in. He said, they all look at your field and see a weed. You looked and saw a wage. That is the whole difference between a poor man who dies poor and a poor man who does not. Wise taught her that winter, what 40 years of scratching a living had taught him. He taught her how a hog thinks, which is more cleverly than a man supposes and more simply. He taught her to move the herd in sections, penning them onto one part of the bottom with hurdles cut from cane. so they'd root that part clean before she let them onto the next, and behind them she should follow with Junie and a borrowed plow, and turn under what they'd loosened, and drop in field peas and turnips, to feed the ground and feed the hogs both. He taught her which of the sows was the leader, and how to read the boar's temper, and how to tell a bred sow's time, by the way she carried and quieted. And he taught her the harder thing, which was patience, the thing the loud men lacked most of all. Do not sell the young sows, he told her. A man who is hungry sells his seed corn and eats one good winter, and starves every winter after. Keep the females. Let the herd grow, sell only what you can spare and never what you cannot replace. Delphine wrote none of it down because she did not need to. She was the kind who learned a thing into her hands and her bones and never lost it. And all that winter in the cold cabin she counted 17 head. If half the young were gilts, and if the gilts bred at 8 months, and if each sow threw 8 and raised 6. She counted it out in the dark, basket after basket of the future, and the arithmetic that had once said ruin, now said something else, entirely, if only nothing went wrong. But something always went wrong. She had learned that too. The second spring, the herd hit 40 and the grass in the cleared sections came up sparse and yellow and beaten, and where she had turned the ground under and sown it, the peas came up green and the turnips fattened, and the earth that 3 families had cursed grew a crop for the first time in a decade. She sold 9 barrows that spring. The young males she'd wintered, drove them into town behind the wagon, and the men at Cruz's Mercantile stood in the door and watched a widow woman drive fat hogs down the main street of a town where every farmer's stock had come thin through the winter, and they said less than they used to. Fat hogs are hard to laugh at. She paid Absalom Cruz his $40 in full and in coin, counting it onto the counter the way she'd once counted her all onto Pettibone's desk, and Cruz took it with a look on his face like a man tasting something he can't name. He asked her careful how she'd fattened them. She said, on what the good Lord grew for free, which was true, and told him nothing, and she bought flour and salt and shot, and a new blade for the plow, and she paid cash, and she left the store owing no man alive a single cent for the first time since her husband died. She rode home, and she did not let herself cry until she was well out of sight of the town, and then she let herself a little for the both of them. It was the drought that changed everything, and it came in the 3rd summer, the summer of 1891, and it came the way ruin always comes in that country, out of a sky so blue and so clean it looked like a blessing. It had not rained proper since April. By June, the creek that fed the low pastures had gone to a chain of green pools, and then to a chain of drying mud, and then to a cracked white record of where water used to be. The cotton curled and the corn tasseled short and fired from the bottom up, the leaves going the color of an old envelope. Tobiah Wise stood in Delphine's yard and looked at the west with his old eyes, and said it would not break before September. He had seen this sky in the old country and again in the year the river shrank, and he was right. He was terribly right. The county began to starve slowly, the way a country starves, not all at once but a farm at a time. The small men first, and here is the thing the drought did, the strange and terrible and providential thing. The Johnson grass did not die. It could not die. That was its whole nature, the thing they had cursed it for. Its roots went down past where the drought reached, down to water no plow ever touched, and while the corn burned and the cotton curled and the pastures turned to bone, Delphine Roche's 85 ruined acres stayed green. Green as spring. Green as money. The very weed that had made the land worthless had made it, in the 1 year it mattered most, the only feed for 40 miles that the sun could not kill. Her hogs, near 90 head now, waded belly deep in green, while every other animal in the county drew down to skin and bone. And Delphine stood at the edge of her field in the killing heat and understood that the town's curse and her fortune had been the same thing all along, only looked at from 2 different distances. And she thought of what old Wise had said about the coin, the earth keeps its riches in, and she understood she had been rich for 3 years and only the drought had let the rest of them see it. Word travels fastest on an empty stomach. By August they were coming out to the Fenwick place, the men who'd laughed by the stove, in their wagons, hat in hand. And it is a hard thing to watch a proud man ask, and Delphine watched a great many of them do it that month. They came because their hogs were dying, and their cows were down, and they had heard, they said, that she had feed. They had not heard it kindly at first. The first story that went around was that she must have stolen or hoarded or made some deal with the devil, because it soothed them better to believe that than to believe she had simply been right. But hunger burns off a man's pride the way the drought burned off the corn, and one by one, they came to the truth of it, which was that a woman they'd pitied had feed and they did not. And here, Delphine came to the moral crossroads of her life, the place Old Wise had, without her knowing it, been preparing her for all along, because a person with the only water in a desert may charge whatever the dying will pay, and no one would have blamed her, and everyone expected it. There was a man who came to her with a different offer, and his name was Rensford Galt, and he was the cattle and hog buyer for the packing concern up at the railhead, a smooth, heavy, smiling man in a good coat who had never once come to the Fenwick place in 3 years of her poverty, and came now 3 times in 1 week. Galt had done his own arithmetic. He knew that in a drought, a man with feed holds every dying farmer in his fist, and he meant to buy that fist. He offered to take her whole herd, every head, at a price that sounded to a woman who had once folded her entire fortune into a stocking, like a dream of money. And then he offered more. He offered to buy the land itself, the 85 acres and the indestructible grass and all, so that he might do to the whole county what she could do. He'd feed them, he said smiling, at a fair rate, a businesslike rate. He sat in her poor cabin with his good coat and his soft hands, and he told her that a woman alone couldn't be expected to manage a thing this size, that she'd be a fool not to take the money and be comfortable, that these were hard men out here and they'd take advantage of her softness, and that he was, in a manner of speaking, offering to protect her from her own good heart. And Delphine, who had learned 3 years before that you do not argue with a verdict, sat and let him talk himself all the way to the bottom of it. And at the bottom of it, he made his mistake, the way the greedy always do, because their greed makes them careless of the people they've decided don't count. He leaned in and he said low and warm that she needn't worry over the neighbors, that once he owned the feed, he'd see the prices set proper, that there was good money in a hungry county if a person had the stomach for it. And did she know, he asked, just how many head were dying out there this week? And he named the number. He named it exactly. And Delphine, who counted everything, knew that number could only have come from one place, because she had heard it herself 2 days before from the mouth of the county assessor, and she understood in one cold, clear instant that Rensford Galt and the assessor were already carving up the county's ruin between them, that the fair, businesslike rate was a noose, and that the man in the good coat had come to her, not to save her, but to make her the rope. She stood up. She was not a large woman, and Galt was a large man, and she stood up anyway, in her poor cabin, and she told him no, Strax. She told him the herd was not for sale, and the land was not for sale, and the feed was not for sale, not to him, not at any price. Galt's smile did a thing then, went thin and flat, and the warmth ran out of his voice, like water out of the creek. And he told her she was making an enemy she'd regret, that a woman couldn't hold a thing like this against men with money and connections, that he'd have the land off her one way or another when the tax came due. And there it was. The threat under the smile, the way there's always a threat under that kind of smile. And Delphine said, the thing that ended it, she said, Mr. Galt, you counted the dying and thought you'd found your fortune. I counted them too, but I counted them as neighbors. Now, get off my land. And he went, because there was nothing else to do, and he was careful going, because a man like that never burns a bridge he thinks he can still cross. But they both knew he had lost something in that cabin he had never expected to lose to a widow and her hogs. What Delphine did instead is the thing they still tell in that county. The thing that turned her from a story the town laughed at into a story. The town told its children. She did not sell the feed. She rode to Tobiah Wise, and the two of them worked it out over a long evening by his lamp. the old man, and the young woman, and a stub of pencil. And what they worked out was this: she would not sell one head of stock to a buyer at all until the drought broke. Instead, she would open her field. Any farmer in the county could bring his dying stock to the Fenwick bottom and graze them on the Johnson grass, and for cattle she'd cut and haul the green fodder to keep them off the plant when the drought turned it dangerous, old Wise having taught her the trick of it. And the price of all this she set not in dollars, for the dying had no dollars, but in a share. When the rain came and the stock recovered and the man got back on his feet, he'd owe her one weaned pig, or one bushel of the first good corn, or a week's labor come planting, whatever he had and could spare and no more. And if a man had truly nothing, then he owed her nothing at all, and could pay her in a handshake and the memory of it. She called it, when they pressed her, only fair. She said, "A field that grew for free ought not be sold too dear to hungry men." And so, all that terrible August and into September, the wagons came, and the dying herds came, and the 85 acres that the county had sold for $1 an acre kept the whole county alive. It was into that late summer, with the field full of other men's animals and her own hogs, penned to one corner and rooting still, that the crib came up out of the ground. Her herd had rooted that far corner of the bottom for 3 years, working deeper each season into ground that had lain undisturbed since before the war, and in the second week of September, the lead sow broke through into a hollow and the earth gave. The sunken frame of an old corn crib that some vanished farmer had built and lost, and let the river silt bury a lifetime ago. And the reason Delphine had laughed, standing over that hole with her hands hanging useless, was the thing the hogs had turned up out of the crib's collapsed floor, the things that caught the light, coins. Not a great chest of pirate gold, for this was Mississippi bottomland, and not a fable, but a farmer's hoard. Gold and silver coin in a rotted leather sack and a cracked stoneware jug. The savings of some hard-handed man who had hidden his money, the only way a man without a bank could, in the ground under his corn, and then died or fled or drowned in the flood that took his crib and left it there for the earth to keep. The earth, old Wise had said, will pay any debt if you find the coin it keeps its riches in. He had meant it as a figure of speech. The earth had taken him at his literal word. She was honest about the money, which surprised no one who knew her by then, and would have surprised everyone who'd known her before. She had the county records searched, and Harlan Pettibone himself, older and humbler now, helped her trace the crib to a family named Ordway who'd been swept out in the flood of '67, with no heir anyone could find, and so the hoard was hers by every law, found on her own land, and it came to something over $400 in good coin, which in that country and that year was a fortune to a woman who, 3 springs before, had owned $85 in a stocking. But here is what she did with it, and it is the last thing and the truest thing. When the rains finally broke in late September, breaking so hard, the dry creek ran brown and full in a single night, and the county came slowly back to life. The men who owed her their weaned pigs and their bushels and their weeks of labor came to pay, as men will when they've been treated square. And Delphine took the pig and the bushel and the labor from the men who could spare them. But from the poorest, the men she knew were still barely holding, she took her share, and then, quietly, without a speech, she gave it back, along with a coin or two out of the Ordway hoard to see them through the winter, and she called it a loan, though everyone knew it was not, and she asked in return only that they tell no one, which of course meant everyone knew within the month. Rensford Galt left the county before the year was out, his packing concern scheme having died the day the whole starving county had somewhere else to turn, and the county assessor found himself watched closely enough that the tax on the Fenwick place came due at the honest figure, and not a penny more, and Delphine paid it in Ordway gold, and thought it a fine joke that the buried farmer had, in the end, paid her taxes for her. And the town that had sold her ruin for $1 an acre, and waited by the stove to watch her break, came instead, over that autumn and the years after, to call her not the foolish widow, but simply Ms. Roach, with a weight on the name, the way you say the name of someone the town has decided to be proud of. Tobiah Wise lived 4 more years, long enough to see her herd grow past 200, and her land turned and turned by the tireless snouts and sown behind them to peas and corn and clover, become the richest bottom in the county, the Johnson grass beaten back at last, not by hatred but by use. Worn down to a manageable thing along the ditches where she let it stand on purpose, for she'd never forgotten what it had done in the dry year, and she was not fool enough to kill the friend that had once been the only friend she had. Delphine Roach lived a long time on that land, and died old in a good house built where the leaning cabin had stood, and she was buried, at her asking, up on the high ground beside Tobiah Wise, and the words she'd had cut into her stone were not her name's dates, nor a verse of scripture, but the old man saying, the one he'd given her in the ruin of her first autumn, that the earth is honest and will pay any debt if you find the coin it keeps its riches in. They tell it still in Coldwater County, the tale of the woman who bought 85 acres of the worst grass in Mississippi for $85, and how her hogs rooted a curse down to a corn crib, and how she fed a whole starving county off a weed. But the old ones, who tell it right, will tell you that the coins in the crib were never the fortune, nor the 200 head, nor the richest bottom in the county. The fortune was that she had looked at the one thing everybody hated and had the patience to ask, not, how do I kill it, but what is it for? The land is full of riches that look like ruin, and full of ruin that looks like riches, and nearly the whole of a life comes down to whether a person has the stillness to tell the one from the other, and the stubbornness to keep looking, when the whole town by the stove has already agreed that you are a fool. She had that stillness, she had that stubbornness, and the earth, being honest, paid her every cent.